So this is another one in a series that talks about how a design or an architecture's greatest strength is its greatest weakness. These are being broken up because I want to keep all the talks at 10 minutes. But really they belong as part of a 30-minute or really an hour-long talk. So in this case, we're going to go back over just real quick the corollaries around this. So I'm going to argue that today's pattern is tomorrow's anti-pattern. And if you pick an approach based on today's pattern, you will actually be cursed by your successors for having picked some anti-pattern, even though at the time this is the best approach. And it's because the approach you pick, whatever strengths that approach has, it turns out those strengths will actually be weaknesses in other situations. And that's just what we deal with. We pick what we got at the time based on what we need at the time, and down the road that may or may not be the right decision still. So I'm going to do, this time we're going to talk about a software system example, SOA versus service-oriented architecture versus a direct call. I like this one. Now these aren't complete. Again, the goal is to just stimulate some thought around this, right? What things about something that make it great are also turned out to be some of its big negatives. And in this case, service-oriented architecture like 10 years ago was the thing. It was the only way to build software. It was a huge push. And it turns out there are some negatives to that. And I put SOA versus direct call in here, but I also put the API gateway in here. And so let's talk about it. So let's look at direct call. Direct call is where you have a network of services that need to talk to each other, and they talk directly to each other through no intermediaries, right? So what are some of the advantages of that? One is no intermediaries. You talk direct. It is high performance. And it turns out that strength, the more partners you add, I'm looking at a team right now, we're looking at like 24 partners. That means we're going to have 24 connections to 24 partner systems. And that becomes a rat nest because those 24 partners probably have their own 20 partners. And so where do you connect? What are the contracts? How are they defined? All of that becomes harder because we're going to connect directly, right? But the advantage of those is we go right to the data. People are always like, go straight to the source. But I don't think they always know what they're getting themselves into. So what is another pro? I get access to the pure data, at least as provided by the data provider, right? So if I'm going to push data, so I did this kind of from a data consumer, but the push is the same thing. I'm going to get access to pure data, or I might give access to data in my format. The downside is all the partners need to know all the contract changes, right? If everybody's connected and you have some mesh of data connectivity, then a couple contract changes could impact everybody, right? And unless they do the right thing in themselves, but a lot of times you'll end up with some kinds of changes that require everybody know. And the direct call, one advantage is you're doing a protocol native to the receiver side, the receiver of the call. Why is that good? Because you get the full fidelity of their experience. If they have data types or other things, right? When you make that call, you get the data in the right format. And the downside is if you got a bunch of partners from the last 10 years, you got protocols and data types from the last 10 years, and you suddenly got to know how they all work. And you would actually argue that that doesn't make sense. And yes, I know that there's an anti-corruption layer pattern, but that still means you got to build the anti-corruption layer, so you still got to know how this works, right? And then the full data fidelity, right? So if I do a direct call, just like I got full native on the receiver side, I get the data format exactly. But the downside is it's completely a producer-generated model, like the receiver-generated model, and so I may end up with data in really weird formats, right? They may not have standardized it, and yeah, I get there. You could do an anti-corruption layer again, but that implies you put an intermediary in, and that comes with its own complexity. And I'll talk a little bit about some of that later. And the good news on a direct call is everybody can generate tracing information. I'm big into the observability triangle and a pyramid triangle, whatever it is. And so, that's great with direct calls. And the downside is everybody owns their own tracing. If you use an intermediary, a lot of times you can get some connectivity information through that intermediary. But if you go direct, man, you don't do that. Everybody's got to generate their own tracing data. They probably should be anyway. So the other one is direct developer experience. Direct calls in a lot of cases might be a pro because you can just connect your developer machine or your developer service to the receiving service. And if you do one of the intermediary approaches, your machine's got to go through an intermediary, and that may come with its own complexity, right? So direct call, A lot of times the best advantage of a direct call is also the weakest part. So service-oriented bus is really where you have an intermediary that does protocol and format conversions, right? And man, I'm gonna have to put that in the talk somewhere. And so what's the beauty of a service bus? Man, single point of contact. I just go to one place and I can get access to everything. But that tends to have a downside. It tends to be a single point of failure. If that system is down for a release or got other issues, everybody's down. An advantage of this protocol and data conversion in the SOA is that you can isolate from producer changes because the SOA picks up those producer changes and guarantees you still have a contract you understand. That comes with a negative because that means that third party is involved in every contract change no matter where it is. And so you're going to be delayed by however long. You won't even be able to start till they get to the point where they're going to, well, in some cases you're isolated. So you're good there, but if there's new fields or something you're going to pick up, you can't just do them right away because you got to wait for the intermediary SOA team to do it. Or if you own the SOA, now you own an extra technology and you got the intermediary, but you actually own those transforms. So there's not an advantage to you there in some ways. Good news, another thing about SOA service bus, single team tracks the changes. Negative, of course, is the single team can get overloaded or be understaffed, and so those changes can drag. And if you own your changes, then you have to own this other technology. And at that point, why are you doing it in the SOA? Because you didn't get any isolation because you had to actually bill the service bus transforms. Nice thing about service bus, they can do orchestration for you. So if I got to do a call and it turns out the backend services are too small calls to make that happen, I can actually put that in the service bus and others can use it. The bad news is that orchestration tends to represent business rules. And so now I've buried business rules into a piece of plumbing, right? And so that's bad. And then another nice thing about the service bus I like sometimes is the service bus will generate its own tracing. This call came in from here, it went there. And so that's good, but you also end up with an extra piece of trace data. If I have system A talking to system B, I now actually end up having to correlate 3 chases, A to service bus to B, rather than just 2 traces, the source call and the destination. So I got 3 systems, but two network hops, and in the other way, you only got 1 network hop. So that's that. I'm going to pick a third one here, and that's going to be the API gateway. So the API gateway is kind of like a SOA, depending on, it could be actually the way some people implement it, but it won't do any orchestration. So that's a piece that's gone. So what is the pro of an API gateway? Kind of like the SOA, well, even more than the SOA, the service buses. It's not a part of the business application, right? The API gateway, we extracted out the routing in the same way we did for the SOA, so that's good. I'm going to pick a downside. This is actually an organizational downside. I was reaching a little bit here. Shared services like API gateway, if they're sophisticated, a lot of places are afterthoughts. Same problem with an SOA. Every place I've worked with a service bus where we did orchestration, 6 years later, we wanted to kill the service bus. And what's another advantage of API gateway? A single API location. This is an advantage of service bus also, but this tends to be, people really push this. The gateway would be for every transaction, not just things that needed to be routed or orchestrated or needed protocol conversion, so that's awesome. But I have seen this be the single point of failure. What will happen is we're going to try and jack in. This is a choke point for all of the calls between different systems, and so we tend to jam extra functionality in. And so you can end up with scalability or uptime. If the API gateway is down, everybody's down, right? There's really no backup plan. And I'm not talking about just like a short system outage, like if you did a configuration error or something. A nice thing about API gateways is you can standardize authentication patterns. You can enforce authentication at the gateway, which is nice. And so everybody doesn't have to implement authentication. They can just do authorization. But authorization, some places will mix in coarse grain authorization in that. Now you've got a mixed concern problem. So really the authorization still ends up being pushed to the remote nodes, but maybe you think of authentication and authorization as segregation of concerns, and that's good. The nice thing about API gateways is you can do easy enterprise features like contracts. The downside is it's easy to mix in extra enterprise features, and so now you've mixed a bunch of concerns for this gateway. You gave it a bunch of extra work that may have been out of the original charter. You may have corrupted the purpose of the gateway. And I would say the other downside of gateways, and compared to especially to Direct Connect, well, sometimes gateways can make this work if you think about it, but a lot of times the developer experience can be bad. We end up having to come up with extra authentication mechanisms because developer services don't run with the same credential style that the production services do. So that would be like an example of, greatest strength is the same thing's greatest weakness. We would go and try and make a decision. All of the approaches actually have validity. So in this case, in a lot of cases, you're going to try and are you going to decide whether you're going to fit the org to the approach or the approach you pick to the org. Everybody always sets they're going to fit the org to the approach and improve the org, but a lot of times the reverse ends up true. And the only other caveat is some other company on the internet's success with an approach is not an indication of your success. The odds of your success or how big it is. So I hope that was useful. Again, this will be split up. I'll probably do another couple of these. Leave some feedback and have a great day.